is going to carry out the transformations that would make permanent revolution a reality in countries like Egypt and Tunisia.
Thank you. Can everyone hear? Yes. I want to start actually with a text message which I sent to a comrade back in London when I was in Tahrir Square on the 6th of February, and I was standing with my friend Wasim Wagdi outside the Mogama building, looking at a sea of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in Tahrir at the height of the uprising against Mubarak. And people were singing. They were singing a song from the 1919 revolution, actually. It was about the unity of Muslims and Christians and Jews against imperialism. And Wasim said to me, you know, all the songs have changed their meaning. Before, we used to sing them on our own. They were communist and nationalist songs, but we sang them to ourselves. Now the crowd shouts them back to us till the stones echo with them. Now this meeting really is about, in a way, one of those songs that the left has sung to itself for a long time. The theory, if you can call the theory of permanent revolution a song. But I am going to argue that this is a theory which the masses in the Middle East are beginning to shout back to us. Maybe not necessarily in exactly the way that we've imagined it over the years, but this is a real live process which is growing and developing in the revolutionary crisis that we see today. And that it's very fitting that this theory, which was born in one revolution, born out of the understanding of the 1905 Russian Revolution and Trotsky's experiences in the 1917 Russian Revolution, should then come back to be something that is taken up and something which I believe can be a real guide to understanding and acting on the processes at play in the Middle East and the revolutionary crisis that we see at the moment. So I want to just start by outlining what I understand by the meaning of permanent revolution. I'm not going to go into detail about Trotsky's theory itself, because there are other meetings on this. So I hope that this will be, in a way, an introduction. It's also because I think that theory is something that can't be just left as a closed book. That, as I said, Trotsky's writing about this was something that evolved out of his experience of being a leading figure in those revolutions, and therefore it grew out of how Russian workers themselves organised. And our understanding of what permanent revolution is in the Middle East has to grow out of how workers in Egypt and Tunisia and across the region are organising and are fighting today, because that's what I mean by the stones are echoing it back to us, that it's the echo back, and that being taken up by the crowds, by the masses, and particularly by the organised working class, as not simply a translation of a theory from Russian into Arabic, but actually as a theory that workers in the Middle East, if they can see this as the theory of their own struggles, of an understanding of that this is something that can lead to a deeper understanding of how the immense revolutionary crisis we see today can turn into the beginning of a process for changing not only the Middle East, but for changing the world for good and for better. So, in terms of what I understand by permanent revolution, in a sense, there are three aspects of the struggle, of the class struggle, that I believe intersect in permanent revolution. At one level, there are a number of slogans, demands, and struggles around three sets of issues. Political democracy, the fight that we see across the world in many different contexts, particularly strongly in the Middle East, demands for a more democratic political system. The fight for social justice, which is another face of the same struggle, the fight against neoliberalism and against being made to pay the price for the crisis. And also the struggle against imperialism as the third aspect, interlaced aspect of the class struggle. Because at one level, all of these different struggles are limited and containable within the system that we know. For example, the explosion of the uprising in Egypt against Mubarak for a proper democratic constitution, for changes to the voting system, for getting rid of the dictatorial regime. Yes, that could and that can still be limited to the kind of parliamentary system that we see in the West. That it's possible to conduct struggles for social justice, obviously within the system in which we live, that there are degrees to which we can claw back some control over parts of the economy, or force the ruling classes to give us concessions in terms of on the social front. And likewise, even struggles against imperialism, it can, at one level, be contained within the existing system. But to me, the understanding the process of what permanent revolution is that when these, on their own, limited and containable struggles, within the context of a revolutionary crisis, and particularly within the context of a mass popular uprisings of the kind that we're seeing in the Middle East at the moment, these limited and containable demands, slogans and struggles actually then grow into something that is not containable within the system, within the capitalist system, and become and grow over, in Trotsky's phrase, from a challenge within the system to a challenge against the system itself. So the demands around political democracy don't stop at the demand for better forms of parliamentary democracy, and actually start talking about, can we drive democracy into every area of our lives, into the workplaces, so that we actually have control, democratic control over the way the economy is run from below. About social justice that goes beyond winning concessions, very minimal concessions from the brutal system we live under. Talking about creating a society of sufficiency and justice for all, from each according to his ability or her ability, to each according to his need. In other words, a socialist society. And likewise, from the struggle against imperialism to the creation of a genuine internationalism, of getting rid of the borders that divide workers from each other, and of the internal divisions that set people against each other, Christian against Muslim, and people against each other on other internal bases, tribe against tribe, and so on. Anything that fractures and divides the working class. Permanent revolution, to me, is the combination of these three struggles in such a way that a new phase in the struggle can be reached. And I'm going to try and explain how I'd argue that what you see actually happening to a certain extent within the revolutions in the Middle East, and what has the potential to grow to a much greater extent in the current revolutionary crisis, is what Rosa Luxemburg called a process of reciprocal action between all these different aspects of the class struggle, that is detonated by the political and social contradictions from the uneven and combined way that capitalist development has taken place in the Middle East. And that at the base of it, the interconnection between these struggles is based on the nature of the capitalist system itself, that the relationship between the political and the economic, between the social and the international, is inscribed in historical materialism since its formation, as Neil Davison points out. That because capitalism is about domination, both the political domination of workers, the state, and their domination at the point of production, that therefore the economic and the political are fused in the capitalist system and can be challenged there. At the current moment, I would argue, therefore, that we're seeing the potential for a process of permanent revolution developing across the Middle East. But what is crucial about this is that it's not some kind of inevitable or natural process that doesn't matter what anyone does to it, it will just happen. That would be a complete travesty of everything that Trotsky stood for, argue for that. It all hinges on the question of the role of the organised working class, and that beyond that, the role of revolutionary organisation within that. And I'll end up with a discussion of the role in this, which I think is crucial, of revolutionary socialist organisation in order to translate the huge potential that's there in the crisis that we see at the moment into struggles that are really the struggles for a better world. So first, I want to talk about what could be called the detonating conditions for this revolutionary crisis, which are based on the understanding of uneven and combined development of capitalism within the Middle East. Just a very quick point about Trotsky's concept of uneven and combined development, which I really don't have time to go into a lot of detail here, and there is an ongoing, very fruitful discussion about this, which people can read in things like the ISJ and other articles. Trotsky's conception was that there was an unevenness in the way that the world economy developed, and that Russia, for example, developed capitalism later than Western Europe. But in his particular insight was around the nature of the combined development, which was that the unevenness led to a combination of both highly advanced and very backward forms of economic relations within the Russian economy. So you had the classic example is you had very concentrated large factories, highly advanced production methods, using the latest techniques that had been imported from Western Europe in the middle of a country where the vast majority of people were peasants whose the way that they produced things was very archaic. And and Trotsky's argument was that this amalgam of contradictory and uneven development led to an highly explosive combination at the political level. Meant you had a concentrated working class that could play a politically leading role in the midst of the sea of peasants. That actually was something that forced the Russian bourgeoisie into the arms of the Tsarist state, and so on. Now, in the case of the Middle East today, evidently we are not talking about kind of pre-capitalist combined with capitalist formations. We're talking about capitalists. The Middle East economy has been a capitalist economy for many decades. There are not any remnants of feudalism in the Middle East. I don't think there are any remnants of feudalism anywhere in the world, but there certainly aren't any in the Middle East. So we're talking about, as Joe Chinara argues in his recent article, the drawing together of different capitalist phases in novel forms in the Middle East. But I would argue that there is a particular layering of different phases of capitalist development in the Middle East, which is the root of the explosive situation that's led to the detonation of these revolts, and that this is an absolutely crucial point in understanding the leading role that the workers' movement has played, both in creating the conditions for this for the revolutions to start, in making that possible, and that this factor also is on which we base the argument that workers can play a leading role in the development of the revolutions and in the process of permanent revolution itself. So the kind of base phase of capitalist development that underlies the recent changes and the bringing in of neoliberal reforms is the one that comes out of the last revolutionary moment in the Middle East, or certainly the greatest revolutionary moment before the current one, which is the anti-colonial revolts of the 1940s and 1950s, which led to the creation of states such as the free officers regime in Egypt, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser from 1952. And what many of these states had in common was that they had a model of state capitalist economic development, plus a system of what could be called corporatist political and social control, which in short form essentially was a kind of Faustian pact between the state and the working class and peasants and so on, that in return for social welfare and return for a programme of economic development which was designed to develop the economy and create and so on, they would cede any claim on political independence. So they would no longer have the right to form independent trade unions or political parties of their own, be absorbed into a state party and state-run trade unions. From the 1970s, and particularly since the early 1990s, a process of neoliberal reforms have transformed many of these economies, particularly the Egyptian one. And the state reneged on the social contract, the Nasserist social contract, this Faustian pact I've just described, from above, through privatisation, transferring hundreds of thousands of workers from the public sector to the private sector, by dismantling large parts of the welfare state. However, as Sam Naguib notes in the pamphlet that's on sale here, the policies of neoliberalism were not about dismantling or reducing the role of the state and economy per se, but were actually about increasing the role of the state as a facilitator for capitalist profit-making at the expense of the working class, creating even more intimate relationship between state and capital. So it's about a kind of repurposing of the role of the role of the state. At the same time, you have the old system of political and social control remaining largely intact. You have a two-class franchise in Egypt, where middle-class people would get to vote for one set of candidates. If you were as a worker or a peasant in a worker and peasants constituency, you would only get to vote for workers and peasants candidates. And most of the workers' candidates under the old, before the revolution, were from the old trade union federation, which was run by the government. So you have this system of political control, which goes back to the Nasserist system, and it's being eaten away both from the top, increasing repression as the state tries to keep a hold on rising levels of social and political protest. And most importantly, while the state reneged on the Nasserist social contract from above, the working class in Egypt, through the strike wave, abrogated it from below. That at the same time as privatisation was taking place and so on, this was contested and fought by workers from below, who organised a huge wave of strikes starting from late 2006. So, what are the uneven and combined features of this? Well, there's the highly uneven way in which the Egyptian economy was integrated into the global economy. Some parts of it very weakly connected with the global economy, particularly parts of the public sector. Some Egyptian capitalists, though, becoming regional and global players in things like telecom markets, such as companies such as Orascom. The vast majority, though, of Egyptians impoverished by this process of neoliberal reform. Neoliberal reform also increased the exposure of the Egyptian economy to global economic shocks, particularly by removing filters and buffers between things like rising food prices on a global level, which could be cushioned in the past by using food subsidies. And there's a degree to which the combination here is actually between the political and the economic, that you have, as I said, this old system of political control without its social justification anymore, without the old trade union federation was a very good example of this. That to a large extent, many workers put up with it, even if they thought the leaders of it were corrupt and useless to a large extent. They were prepared to allow it to function because it delivered benefits to them. That it was through that mechanism that it redistributed benefits within the workplace, and that to a certain extent workers could feel that perhaps the leaders of these state-run unions might have the ear of the government because they were part of the state. It is certainly true that it was not until after 2006 that you see any kind of mass breaking of workers' relationships with the old trade union federation. It is the context of the strike wave that allows independent unions and activists to begin to build genuinely independent workers' organisation. And if you look at the fate of the old trade union federation, which is again, as I say, was played a key role in the electoral system as well, delivering workers in buses to go and vote for Mubarak. In fact, if you look at interviews that were done, even with the Mahalla strikers in 2007, they would say to the camera, we went to vote for, they would be addressing Hosni Mubarak directly to the camera and saying, we went to vote for you, come and help us. There was still, even at that stage, you could see the hold that this old political system had. And it was the thing that Mubarak actually held on to till the last, which is why Hussein Magawa, who's the head of the old trade union federation, is in jail for his part in organising the Battle of the Camel when the thugs came to attack revolutionaries in Tahrir Square. So you can see, I think, some of the absolutely explosive nature of this uneven and combined development. And just to emphasise again, what we're talking about here is a layering of different capitalist phases in the context of the Middle East. And although I've talked about Egypt, you can make very similar arguments, I think, about developments in Tunisia, and there are many similarities of the situation in other countries in the region. So those are the detonating conditions. But what does that mean in terms of once the process has started in terms of the development of the revolution? I would argue that if you look at that, firstly from that sketch, if we're talking about the relationship between economic and political demands and the struggles in those domains over political democracy and social justice, you can see even from that how they are intertwined from the start in the whole example of uneven and combined development, that there are social and democratic aspects to it, the lack of political democracy in order to contain social protest and so on. And so it is unsurprising that from the start the revolution in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere in the Middle East, but particularly in those two countries, has had social and democratic aspects. I will also argue, and come on to this in a minute, that it has always from the start had an anti-imperialist aspect, that again imperialism is also part of this of uneven and combined development within the region. So what we see then happening with the uprising against Mubarak is, and against Ben Ali, a very strong process developing of what Rosa Luxemburg, in her writings about the 1905 revolution, called reciprocal action between the social and political demands. In the article I've written in the ISJ, I've gone into more detail about how I believe that this process of reciprocal action can be intimately linked to the development of permanent revolution. That there is a kind of interlacing struggle between the two, both economic and political demands, which has to have a kind of shifting of emphasis from the economic back to the political, from the economic back to the political, but beyond the kind of pendulum-like motion that perhaps appears from Luxemburg's writings. But actually, it has to have a trajectory upwards towards the apex of the state. So what I mean by that is that you can see in the context of revolutionary crisis how actions taken, if you like, in one domain, in the political domain, feed directly into the political and into the economic. A concrete example of this is the process of tathir, of the cleansing of the system after the fall of Mubarak and after the fall of Ben Ali in Tunisia, where, in a sense, in every workplace in Egypt, practically, on the 13th of February, 2 days after a day or so after Mubarak fell on the Friday, then people had a day off to celebrate, and they went back to work. And just reading press reports of this process, absolutely phenomenal. I was looking at just one newspaper report from a town called Mansoura, which is in the Delta, and literally practically every public sector workplace was listed as having some kind of protest, sit-in, occupation by workers demanding the removal of the little Mubarak, who was their boss. Because you can imagine this, the scale of the uprising, millions of people in the street, 1,000 martyrs dead, absolutely epic confrontation with the forces of the state. And people go back and they look at the same boss who's in the NDP, who's in the old ruling party, and they think, why are we putting up with this? And literally, within hours across large parts of Egypt, that confrontation, that process had started. But what's interesting about this, and this is something that is common to other revolutionary situations, is that you could argue, is this a political demand? Well, it's a political demand because it's about getting rid of the corrupt figures from the old regime, the people who are, and it sits squarely within this framework of getting rid of the old system, and as a replication of the process of the uprising itself against Mubarak. But on the other hand, it's an economic demand. It's about removing the boss. It's about fundamental rearrangement of labour relations in the workplace. It's about pushing the frontier of control into something different. It's about workers' control from below, even if the people taking part in it don't necessarily conceive that process. Now, this happens unevenly, but in some contexts, this is combined with forms of workers' organisation, which have really started to push the boundaries of what people think, of what people can be achieved, and show the interaction between the political and the social and the social demands. For example, again, I talk a bit about it in the article in the journal. What happened with the Manchester Bakri hospital workers, which I will never tire of telling people about this story because it's fantastic, is that workers in this general hospital in Cairo set up an independent union. It's actually started by a few people, including a guy who's a doctor, who went back from Tahrir and started a petition about doctors' rights and pay and conditions. And then the nurses kept coming up to him and saying, "Can we sign?" He said no. He said, "No, because you're nurses, it's about doctors." And they wouldn't give up. And they eventually thought, why am I doing this? Actually, no, the nurses could sign it too. And out of those conversations, they started arguing, well, let's have a general union for everybody in the hospital. And a large percentage of the hospital workers joined the union. And then suddenly, actually, the hospital workers' union is running the hospital. They decided they were to get rid of the old management, of the old director. And so there was a few kind of standoffs and confrontations, and eventually they got fed up with him because he was trying to block their attempts to sort of get rid of corruption and make life better in the hospital for patients and staff. So they called a meeting with him and they said, "Okay, you're sacked." He said, "You can't do this." They said, "Actually, the security guards are members of our union and they're escorting you off the premises." So then they decided, well, what are we going to do afterwards? So they decided to have an election for his successor. And so they held an election. They built a ballot box. They had the electorate rolls for the hospital staff. About 500 people voted. They had electoral observers from the newly formed Cairo Bus Workers Union, who they obviously thought were much better electoral observers than anyone from a political party. And they elected a new director. And then they rang up the Minister of Health and they said, "We've elected a new director for the hospital." And the Minister of Health apparently said, "You can't do that. You can't elect your boss. You can't elect your father." And they said, "Well, sorry, we've elected him, and if you don't agree to it and appoint him officially, then it'll be front page news in every Egyptian newspaper tomorrow." And so 2 hours later, then a fax comes through from the Ministry of Health, officially appointing the elected director. Now, okay, that's one hospital in Cairo, although actually now there are general unions, I think, in 4 hospitals in Cairo, and 2 of them are members of the new Independent Union Federation. And you can see there how impossible it is to separate the economic from the political, and in fact how, in the context of this generalised crisis, you can go very quickly from something about doctors' pay and conditions to something that challenges the prerogatives of state power. Actually, the hospital workers in Manchester Bakri, porters, nurses, doctors, forced the Egyptian Minister of Health to recognise their democratically elected director. I mean, if that's not a victory for workers' power, I don't really know what is. The point about this is that, as I said, there is this reciprocal action, this interlacing between the different sides of the struggle. And I want to talk now, though, about another aspect where I believe you could see another aspect of permanent revolution where you could see, again, a reciprocal action between different interlacing sides of the struggle, which is between the national and the international aspects of the struggle. Now, Trotsky, in his theory, says, it's in the summary of what permanent revolution is, he says, "The socialist revolution begins in the national arena, it unfolds on the international arena, and is completed in the world arena. Thus the socialist revolution becomes permanent revolution in the newer and broader sense of the word. It attains completion only in the final victory of the new society on our entire planet." Now, that is absolutely necessary and right as a sense of the overall progression of permanent revolution. And I think actually you do have to say that it has to begin and win victories within national units, or at least within areas. before the victories that are won at a national level make a huge difference at the other levels of the struggle. However, again, as in the case of the relationship to political and the economic struggles, I'd argue that there is a process of reciprocal action before we get to the point of the seizure of state power by workers, which is what's generally focused on in terms of thinking about the international dimension of permanent revolution is the idea that you seize power in workers can seize power in one country and then they have to be followed by the seizure of power by workers in other countries, for obvious reasons, in that a workers' state in one country will be isolated, surrounded by imperialism, attacked and destroyed. That actually, that's the point of Trotsky's argument here. But there's actually a very important dynamic already going on long before we talk about anything in relation to workers potentially taking power in the Middle East. At one level, you could argue you have an aggregation, a collection of national revolts going on in many different countries in the Arab world, which just happen to be taking place in a limited geographical area at approximately the same time. But obviously that's not a very satisfactory explanation of the wave of revolutions that we're seeing at the moment. The conscious borrowing of symbols, of techniques of struggle, of solidarity, of the slogan that went from Tunisia. I mean, in Tunisia, in the streets, they shout, "Shab yurid isqat al-nizam." Now, Egyptians don't talk like that. It's classical Arabic. And Egyptians would say something else. They would say, "Mush hanimshi huwa hayimshi," something like that. "We're not going, he's going." They would talk in completely different dialect. Across Egypt, millions of people shouted, "Ashab yurid isqat al-nizam." How did they know about it? Because it's what Tunisians shouted. And one of the reasons they knew about it was because they saw it on Al Jazeera, because they read about it on Facebook. It's because it was brought to them by some of the interconnections between the different countries in the world, in the region. And actually, it's not just at the level of slogans, but directly you could see, particularly in the Tunisian and Egyptian cases, how the struggle in one country has affected the other. A very good example was about the Day of Rage in Egypt. The Tunisian revolution, fall of Ben Ali, takes place on the 14th of January, and then there's a gap between the 25th of January, where the Egyptian revolution starts and people go into the streets. And on the 28th of January was one of the crucial moments in the Egyptian revolution. It's called the Day of Rage, which was the first really mass mobilisation against Mubarak. And it was also the point at which the threshold between large protests to literally popular insurrection was crossed, decisively breached across Egypt. And it was there were huge battles with the police. And it was the day, in fact, that the Egyptian people defeated the Egyptian state. They defeated the Interior Ministry forces and forced them to withdraw from the streets. Now, that Day of Rage had an effect on Tunisia because it actually prompted a radicalisation in the Tunisian revolution. That there was a Day of Rage was called in Tunisia a few days later, directly inspired by seeing what had happened in Egypt, to push forward the process of revolution in Tunisia, to ask for more, to demand that the government that had been appointed the government that had been appointed after the fall of Ben Ali should speed up the process of getting rid of the old party, and so on. However, that also, I don't think, is enough to explain the interaction between the national and the international struggle here. There's a deeper unity, which I talked about before, in terms of the origins, the detonating circumstances of the revolt, that there are enough commonalities across the Middle East for revolution to detonate almost simultaneously in more than one national unit, and actually to leap into new situations where there are not necessarily so much in common in the social structure or economic structure. And crucially, there is interaction between the national and the international during the revolution itself, that the simultaneity of protest intensifies the crisis and reduces the room for manoeuvre by the ruling class, that trying to satisfy, for example, the social and political demands in one country by one ruling class, perhaps with the support of others in the region, might be achievable, but satisfying them simultaneously in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Bahrain, in Syria, it becomes incredibly difficult. That it's much more difficult to contain the revolution within those limited understandings of what the struggles for democracy and social justice and against imperialism mean when that process is taking place on a regional basis. It actually makes, for example, imperialist intervention by the imperialist powers both more necessary and more dangerous in terms of more unpredictable as to whether it will be effective or not. Thus, there's a real interaction between events and processes at the national and international level during a regional revolutionary crisis of the kind we're witnessing today in the Middle East. And again, a concrete example: Egyptian workers' struggle for social justice and against neoliberal stabilisation has ripples across the region. The fact that the Egyptian, you can see it internally within Egypt, that the Egyptian government has just rejected the IMF's money. They said, we don't want the IMF's money, and the IMF are absolutely like, but we didn't even say we would, make you cut everybody's jobs. We were only going to make you, get into debt a little bit. They were like, no, we don't want that money. And I think that is because they are well aware that it's a testament to the fact that Egyptian workers are rejecting and are fighting against neoliberalism from below, that they will not stand for the imposition of austerity measures, that they have already been in the streets fighting the state to overthrow Mubarak, and they're not about to allow the IMF to walk all over them, and that the Egyptian state knows this. You can also see, again, I'll vote very briefly on this, in the question of Palestine, how the national and the international interact. That the struggle for the liberation of Palestine is something that's played out within each Arab country, and also at a regional level, of course, in opposition to the existence of the Zionist state. And even more importantly, we have an aggregation of national struggles in one particular region in the context of a global crisis that also has a potential here to grow over. I mean, we've already seen, of course, protest tactics leap from Egypt to Spain in the context of what's going on in Greece at the moment. And this transmits back very strongly the message that it's not an Arab question, it's not simply about Arab dictatorship, it's about resistance to austerity which has relevance on a global scale. And that, as Trotsky said, that growing over from the national to the international is absolutely crucial to its success. In the last few minutes, I want to come on to really the most important part of this, which is about workers' leadership in this process. We talked about potential, about possibility, but what can make real this process of a permanent revolution? Trotsky's argument about Russia was that the working class was the only social force which was capable of leading a revolutionary movement to break Tsarism. Peasants couldn't, the bourgeoisie couldn't, and that the working class found itself thus leading both the struggle for bourgeois political democracy and turning into a struggle for something that was far beyond bourgeois democracy and far beyond the system, and that he argued on the basis of this that workers could seize state power and begin a struggle to build socialism. I think you can argue that, looking at the Middle East today, that only the working class has both the social collective power and the interest in solving all three of these problems, if you like: the problem of political democracy, the problem of social justice, the problem of imperialism. And that only the working class, the organised working class, has the capacity to lead in the struggles that interact between all three of these. And we can already see, I think very clearly, the leading role that organised workers have played in two of the most important of the revolutions that have taken place so far in Tunisia and Egypt. That, as I mentioned already, that it was workers who broke from below with the old system of political and social control. In the case of Tunisia, again, it was from below. Workers organised and broke the leadership of the Trade Union Federation, the UGTT, from Ben Ali's regime, which forced them to call a general strike, which was one of the absolutely fundamental aspects in Ben Ali's fall. In a more broader sense as well, you can see, contrary to some of the theorists who have argued that in the global south, that organised workers can't play this kind of role anymore, that you have too many people working in informal jobs, for example, without contracts, or working in small workplaces for this vision of organised battalions of workers like the Petrograd workers of 1917 leading the working class to socialism. But actually, if you look at the concrete mechanics of what happens in the strike wave in Egypt, it is the big public sector workplaces that play a leading role. It's the Mahalla textile workers, employed 27,000 of them in the biggest factory in the Middle East. It is the postal workers, the bus workers. Of course, there are struggles by people in small workplaces, but actually the ones that have led the struggle and the ones whose mechanisms of struggle becomes a pattern for other sectors of society is organised workers, including white collar workers like the tax collectors. And we have in the room Kamal Abu Aita, who's the president of the Tax Collectors Union here. Who I have to say I'm very embarrassed to be talking to him about workers' leadership. He is one and I'm not. But what's fascinating about what Kamal and his colleagues in the tax collectors unions was, they built a series of strike committees which led a national strike. They had a higher strike committee, they led a national strike of 50,000 tax collectors, they wanted 300% pay increase. Which is very impressive. They're civil servants, they're part of the state, they're part of the public sector, they're like the colleagues in the PCS who are striking today. Their model of organising has been taken up by doctors, been taken up by pilots, it's been replicated across large sections of the working class. So I think you can see concretely, again, the examples of how this works. Very finally, because I'm being sent messages to shut up, but I'm actually got to the whole crux of the meeting. But I would argue that in order to translate this process, the potential and this process of permanent revolution into reality, you need more than independent unions. That actually you need also revolutionary socialist organisation. You need a revolutionary party, and that this was the lesson that Trotsky drew in the end from 1905, although it took him 12 years to get there, because Trotsky was elected to the leadership of the Petrograd Soviet, of the Workers' Council that grew out of the Russian Revolution in 1905, but he only joined the Bolshevik Party in 1917. And he did say at one point that those 12 years were the really wasted ones of his life in many ways. That we could see actually that even at the level of the independent unions, that independent unions in Egypt, I don't think would have been likely to have happened at all without conscious political intervention by people who are political activists from different political traditions, from a Nasserist political background, like Kamal himself, from a revolutionary socialist perspective as well. But it was a conscious political decision to try and build independent unions. And if that's true for building independent unions, how more true is it, I would argue, for building organisations which go beyond the struggle for social justice within the existing system and negotiating with the state and doing all the things that we need trade unions to do, to actually challenging for state power and saying that we cannot solve the question of political democracy, of social justice, nor the problem of imperialism without breaking the state, without setting in motion a new process, a new revolution, a permanent revolution. And that's why I'm a member of a socialist organisation, and why, if you're not, and you want to see a new society, not only in the Middle East but here, I'd urge you to join us.